Welcome back to Bitcoin Season 2. The following conversations were recorded live at Inscribing Nashville behind the stage at the Blockspace studio. We are super happy to partner with Inscribing Atlantis on this conference series and feature extended, unscripted, off-the-cuff conversations with some of the headlining guests of that conference. Make sure to subscribe to the new Bitcoin Season 2 YouTube channel. Bitcoin Season 2 is the handle, and check out other Blockspace media content, in particular the Guart Show and the Mining Pod. If you aren't already, head to blockspace.media to subscribe to our newsletter featuring ordinals, runes, Bitcoin mining, Bitcoin tech content, and insights. We are doing a lot of cool stuff in that newsletter over the coming couple months. And make sure to check out the Blockspace social media. We will be announcing some things, including a conference here very soon. But without further ado, let's get to this interview. Welcome to Bitcoin Season 2. I've got David Say, co-founder of Babylon Chain, I believe you said Bitcoin security sharing protocol?
Security sharing protocol, correct.
Security sharing, and raised some 70 million recently, led by Paradigm, and you've had a ton of users on the platform already. What are your actual latest numbers on user growth during your rollout phase?
Yeah, so in our testnet, we launched our testnet a few months ago. There were, in the first 48 hours, there were 100,000 stakers.
Gosh, so that probably represents about 100,000 users staking
Bitcoin on the testnet.
Yeah. Well, we'll get into Babylon Chain and how it works, but I kind of want to roll back and zoom back and talk to you about how we got here, because I looked at some little background work on you, and you are pretty cross-domain in the research space, from like telecommunications and 4G algorithmic, pretty foundational stuff for a lot of our phones and telecommunications, and then genomics too, I believe.
Yeah.
And you lead a lab at Stanford. I'm kind of curious of this. What would you say? You're a researcher, but what would you say? What kind of researcher are you?
Yeah, I would say I'm a first principle researcher. So I like to look into an area and try to identify the first principles that require research and start from there. So because I have this attitude of always extracting the first principle in an area, I don't confine myself to a particular area. So throughout my career, I've worked on multiple different areas depending on areas that excite me at the moment.
And that makes a lot of sense, because if we consider like what Babylon Chain is, and even just why professors or specialists would even engage in this crypto landscape, it makes sense that you see more cross-domain people, because I think like typically industry experts tend to be myopic about their particular niche expertise. And I see that generalists, people who are cross-domain, tend to really get these systems. Would you say that's correct, and maybe what drives like how you think about these systems?
Yeah, I would actually do a little bit correction. Not only industry experts, but also academic experts tend to be very narrow, because the nature of the research enterprise, because there's just so much knowledge out there, right? This is not back in the Newton days where hardly anything's known. A lot is known. To become an expert, you really have to dig very deep into an area, and that's how the entire research enterprise sort of incentivize people. So relatively few people like to take a broad view of things, and I'm sort of one of those who like to look into new area, try to identify the bottlenecks in the area, and focus the research on that.
So yeah, is that part of what guides your lab at Stanford as well? I'm kind of curious about that, because it looks like it's a lab which touches several different types of things.
It touches several different types of things, but at any moment, we focus on one thing. So I started my career in the telecom area. So in around late 90s, it is about like the time now in blockchain, that as infrastructure is only beginning to emerge in telecommunication, particularly in wireless communication. At that time, there were less than 1 million cell phones. Imagine 1 million. Now we're talking about 6, 7, 8 billion cell phones. There are more cell phones than human beings, I think, at this moment. And so the growth is tremendous, but all this is built on the infrastructure that was done in the early days, and I was lucky to be part of that wave. So I had the opportunity to take a first principle look at that area and make some fundamental contribution. So every time you use a cell phone, you'll be using an algorithm that I've invented in those days.
Do you see similar trends? You make analogies to the late 90s or even early 90s. Do you see similar trends in blockchain, Bitcoin, decentralized crypto economic systems? Do these feel similar to you, having now experienced both?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of similarity. So in the 90s, when people think about phones, they think about talking. You talk on a phone. But nowadays, when we use a phone, actually we spend very little time talking to the phone. We'll be doing many things on the phone, but talking is sort of one of the relatively low level activity. And so the transition at that time is to go from voice to data. And at that time, so there was a lot of research effort on to how to, as we know, data is very bandwidth hungry. So the question is, how do we increase the bandwidth, the wireless bandwidth, to accommodate all this data? But at that time, actually, the demand is not like huge. It's not like billions of people want to use a phone to communicate. But there was just an intrinsic understanding of people that once we build it, people will find the applications to use up that bandwidth. And indeed, that's what happened. We built it, and then the iPhone came along. And the iPhone is kind of the application that drives all this use of this bandwidth that we have.
So that might be a great segue into what Babylon Chain, where you currently sit, in that is this a correct statement, that you are leveraging a proof of work chain to improve a proof of stake system?
Yeah. Maybe I can clarify a little bit about the terminology or the name of our project.
Yeah.
So Babylon is actually the protocol that we're building. As one component of this protocol, there is a Babylon chain. But actually the bigger picture that we want to emphasize on is the Babylon protocol. So the Babylon protocol is really a cross-chain protocol. It allows the security of one chain, Bitcoin, to be shared with any proof-of-stake chains or even roll-ups. So it's a cross-chain protocol. And the Babylon chain that we built is kind of a intermediary layer that mediate between the Bitcoin and all the other proof-of-stake chain and roll-ups in the world.
Got you. And I listened to one presentation of yours where you identify, I think, 3 of the limitations of proof-of-stake. And I'll invite you to kind of reprise those. I think you said you have longer unbonding times given existing proof-of-stake systems, censorship not accountable, and it's difficult to bootstrap small chains. Could you Could you elaborate on those for me?
Yeah. So let's start with the third one, which is proof-of-stake chain requires capital. So typically, when you start a new proof-of-stake chain, typically the way that people have been generating proof-of-stake chain is to launch a token, use that token as a staking asset. However, that makes it very difficult to bootstrap a new chain because by definition, a new token is typically very low market cap. And so the security is very low. And so that's the first problem. And essentially, our idea is to use the huge asset of Bitcoin, 1.4 trillion, to essentially use that as a security asset instead of or in addition to the native asset that a chain generates. So that's sort of the first, I would say, the first order idea that we're bringing to the table.
Yeah, and then the market obviously desires quicker unbonding times, and that's just difficult to accomplish securely given most proof-of-stake chains.
Yes, and so with our protocol, not only we bring this bigger asset, we also solve the unbonding time problem because in a proof-of-stake chain, the reason why the unbonding is a very safe and secure problem is because there's a chicken and egg problem in proof-of-stake chain. You are running the chain to maintain the stake distribution, but at the same time, you're using that to secure the chain. So it's like a chicken egg problem. By using Bitcoin staking, we sort of break the chicken egg problem, and so we can solve the unbonding problem as well. So instead of 14 days or 21 days of unbonding, we can do it within a short few days.
And that gets into what I think is one of the most interesting underexplored components of Bitcoin, which is its timestamping mechanisms. I think, we spent 15 years talking about how Bitcoin is this incredible monetary network, but I feel that it's not explored enough Bitcoin's timestamping mechanism. Maybe we could just jump right to that, because that's one of the ways, if I understand correctly, you have designed Babylon Protocol for Bitcoin to timestamp and refer back to that.
Yeah.
Could you kind of elaborate on that for me?
Yeah. So maybe just take one step back and sort of situate where this timestamping is. In some sense, we are using two aspects of the Bitcoin chain. Okay. One is this timestamping aspect. That is, by ordering blocks, then you are essentially creating a very secure timestamping system. And you can use that to timestamp events that happen outside the Bitcoin chain. Okay? So that's one thing. Two is we're using the asset of Bitcoin. Now, you've mentioned that everyone knows that Bitcoin is a very valuable asset. But the question is whether this valuable asset can be used to provide security benefits for proof-of-stake chains. That is our innovation, to be able to connect that asset to the security of a new bootstrapping chain, for example. So those are the two things. But let's just focus on the timestamping that you asked. So timestamping, okay, is basically a way of ordering events, okay? And ordering of events is kind of the core to consensus. And so that's why when we built this timestamping protocol, we're basically using the Bitcoin security to timestamp proof-of-stake blocks. And that would provide a ordering of the proof-of-stake blocks. Now, however, what we discovered is that timestamping alone is not enough to provide security. And the reason is because timestamping on Bitcoin is a very slow process. Because Bitcoin takes 1 hour to confirm a transaction. So it takes 1 hour to sort of provide a reliable timestamp. And so that only gives what we call a slow timescale security to the proof-of-stake chain. If you want to complement that with a faster timescale security, you need stake. You need to provide stake because that allows validators to vote very fast. And that's where the Bitcoin staking protocol comes in. So if we combine the two, we get both long-range and short-range security.
And when you say long-range, does that also reference this long-range attack option?
Yeah, and that's where the unbonding, that's where the fast unbonding comes from, is because we solve this long-range attack problem using the timestamping.
And what's interesting is I think a lot of people think about Bitcoin blocks. A lot of people talk about block time, but we're actually talking about the times that are included in the blocks themselves, which are referencing the actual like UTC time from the block producers.
Yeah. And so the time that is included in the block itself is actually not reliable because the miner that proposed that block can actually put a fake timestamp there. So that is not the timestamp we're talking about. The timestamp we're talking about is basically achieved by the block height, okay? And the block height is very reliable because the block height is a result of the mining, of the whole mining population.
You're listening to Bitcoin Season 2 by Blockspace Media. Check out other Blockspace content like The Gwart Show and The Mining Pod. Head to our website, blockspace.media, and sign up for our newsletter, delivered to your inbox multiple times per week. Otherwise, let's get back to the show. You mentioned that one of the core, I think, marketing points and really selling points of Babylon is that, as you mentioned, there's $1.4 trillion of Bitcoin. A lot of Bitcoiners would say, well, saving is using this Bitcoin, and I would agree with that, but it is capital, and a lot of it we would consider to be idle. This is in huge demand, and Bitcoin does struggle sometimes to differentiate itself from ETH, which is kind of this native yield-bearing asset. Does the fact that you're able to give Bitcoin a yield component, does it make it more attractive than ETH, perhaps, in some capacity?
Yeah. So if you compare what happened to ETH and Bitcoin, right? Those two are the biggest assets. So it's interesting to sort of compare the difference and similarity. So both ETH and Bitcoin was originally proof of work. So when you say that ETH have a native yield bearing, that's not the case before the merge. Now, after the merge, which was 2 years ago, ETH becomes a yield bearing asset because of the staking primitive. And essentially what we are doing for Bitcoin is to give Bitcoin the same yield bearing possibility to Bitcoin as well. I want to emphasize that this yield-bearing aspect of Ethereum is very special because this is a very native yield-bearing. It is very different from participating in a DeFi protocol or in a lending protocol because those are subject to various market risk. And this staking yield has no such market risk. And so therefore, having this kind of low risk staking yield-bearing possibility is very important, I believe, for an asset to participate in the DeFi ecosystem, because that becomes like a very basic primitive that people can build other stuff on top of.
Especially if you're a true believer like I am, where we will eventually natively denominate things in terms of Bitcoin or other crypto assets, it would make sense then to think, well, what does a world where those proliferated assets look like that we would want to earn yield on those things? So this is very forward thinking to me. One of the core components of a successful proof of stake system is slashing and figuring out how to slash or disincentivize bad behavior. I know you describe it in the light paper, but can you talk me through how slashing works in the Babylon protocol?
Okay. So actually how slashing works in the Babylon protocol is exactly how slashing works in the Ethereum protocol and in Cosmos proof of stake protocol. So it's a very common way of building a slashing mechanism. So our innovation is actually not creating a whole new crazy way of doing slashing. Our innovation is to enable the slashing to be done natively on the Bitcoin chain without using smart contract. So that is the main innovation. Now, going back to how slashing works, basically how slashing works is that when a validator double signs a block, okay, that double sign is essentially the same as double spend in Nakamoto's language, okay? So this double sign is converted into a provable offense, and that will result in the slashing of the stake fund. That's how, in general, how slashing works in proof of stake chain. Now, we enable this functionality on the Bitcoin chain, although the Bitcoin chain has no smart contract to process this. And that's really where the heart of the technological innovation of our project is.
Because in the mechanism for slashing is that you, I might say this wrong, expose part of the private key, and you have watchtowers which see this and can spend that slashed Bitcoin.
But maybe you have certainly done your research.
Okay.
But maybe I can help to walk through for your audience who did not do this research.
Yeah.
So how slashing works on Ethereum is the following, okay? If you have double sign a block, okay, then this double signing will become an evidence that is processed by the slashing smart contract, okay? The slashing smart contract, which will deduct the staked ETH. Okay, so that's roughly how it works on Ethereum. Now, in Bitcoin, there's no smart contract. So therefore, there's no way for the contract to process this evidence of double sign. Although it's a cryptographically undeniable evidence, there's no smart contract, so it cannot be processed. So when you mention about this mechanism of extracting the private key from the double signing, it is basically a cryptographic shortcut to help Bitcoin to be able to slash the stake Bitcoin, even though there's no smart contract. And to do that, we need to use some cryptographic smartness to help Bitcoin. So Bitcoin, shall we say, I know that your podcast is focused on Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is actually a very primitive chain in terms of the ability to write contracts on it. It is primitive for a very good reason, because you want to be secure. So you don't want like a lot of smart contract bugs and so forth. But because of the lack of expressibility, there's very limited things you can do. And essentially what we're saying is that, hey, actually if you complement it with some smart cryptography, you can actually do something even with the limited expressibility.
And so you designed a Babylon protocol and you will implement Babylon chain, and that will be what you use to power these through the Cosmos ecosystem, these new Cosmos chains. Is that kind of the model here, or is the Babylon protocol chain agnostic, perhaps?
Yeah. So let's try to unlock a few things that you mentioned, right? One is that our protocol, the Babylon protocol, is agnostic to whether or not the POS chain is a Cosmos chain or not. We designed it in a very modular fashion that the protocol can plug into almost any proof of stake chain and provide the Bitcoin security through staking. Okay, that's number one. Number two is that the way I described the protocol so far, in fact, there is no Babylon chain. It's just Bitcoin and the proof of stake chain that wants to enjoy the Bitcoin security. So that chain can be any chain. Now, the reason why we need a Babylon chain is because we need a timestamping mechanism between the consumer chain, the final chain that uses Bitcoin staking, and Bitcoin. And the timestamping is done through the Babylon chain, because if every chain uses the timestamping itself to Bitcoin, that will consume all the Bitcoin space. Because you may have thousands of POS chains. Timestamping to Bitcoin, that's too much. So the Babylon chain acts as sort of a timestamp aggregator to efficiently timestamp all these chains simultaneously.
Do you hash the timestamps and post those, or how does that?
So we basically hash all the timestamps of many proof of stake chain and just post one hash into the Bitcoin.
That's really interesting. There's some other interesting timestamping mechanisms. There's open timestamps from Peter Todd, and
that's right.
And
that's one of the early projects using timestamp Bitcoin to timestamp files, important files.
Yeah. So you're currently in testnet still, right?
Yeah, we are in testnet number 4. Actually, we're in the 4th testnet now.
4th testnet. Do you know how many more testnets there will be?
This will be the last testnet before the mainnet launch.
And mainnet launch, what does that look like? Do you have a timeline?
So the mainnet will launch in multiple phases. Phase 1 is the first launch. We're targeting sometime in August. So we are now in July, so we're talking about a few weeks, okay? We're still working on a few things, but we should be able to launch. So in mainnet phase 1, so one step back, the Babylon protocol is essentially a two-sided marketplace. So a good analogy is Uber, okay? So what does Uber have? Uber have drivers and they have passengers. So that's a two-sided marketplace. In a two-sided marketplace, you need to bootstrap the two-sided marketplace. It's very hard to bootstrap from both sides. So in the case of Uber, they bootstrap by first recruiting a bunch of drivers. And then they can tell the passengers, say, hey, there are drivers now. You can join the system because now we have cars for you to be on. So for our case, the drivers, the analogy, are the Bitcoin holders, okay? Because they provide us security. So phase 1 is to bootstrap the system by recruiting a bunch of Bitcoin stake. Okay. So now in phase one, Bitcoin holders can stake Bitcoin onto the protocol. Okay. And after we accumulate a sufficient level of stake, then in phase two, we will now launch a few chains, starting with the Babylon chain. And those chains will receive Bitcoin security from the stake that we accumulated from phase one. So that's how we bootstrap the system. We start with the supply, and then we bring in the demand.
Got you. What do you think? This would have pretty deep implications, I think, for the proof of stake ecosystem and future proof of stake chains. One of the, as you've identified, one of the structural barriers for these young proof of stake chains is that they have structural issues getting off the ground because people get in. It's very tempting or even planned to like take advantage of their economic security weaknesses.
Yeah, or they're very centralized.
Yeah, they're very centralized.
Or they're controlled by entirely the founders.
Exactly. So your proposal is that this offers mitigation or solution to that. Do you think this perhaps kicks off a new era for proof of stake chains? Because I feel like in the past couple of years, there's like the launch of new chains has been so proliferated and kind of exhausting. And the market has been trying to figure out if a lot of these are even worth throwing money into. Maybe this is a missing piece for capital to.
Yeah. So what our vision is that when you launch a new chain, you should really be focusing on the application that you're building, rather than focus on trying to recruit enough stake by offering, like bribing people, right, to come and stake with you. So the Bitcoin staking will provide a strong level of security on which you can build new applications. So that's the vision. And I believe if we're successful, we will indeed usher a new era of how proof of stake chains are launched. Instead of everyone launching a token and then use that token to secure it itself, we can use Bitcoin as the shared asset. That's number one. But I think if we're successful, it is also a revolution, I think, for Bitcoin holders. Because in some sense, Bitcoin holders have never played any significant role in security. The miners play all the role. And this is the first time using our primitive that Bitcoin holders can actually provide security in a low-risk, yield-bearing way. So I think that this is going to be a very important use case for Bitcoin. And so, yeah, I think our project is a pretty ambitious project because if it's successful, then it would impact not only the proof-of-stake world, but the Bitcoin world as well.
That is a very, very big idea. Maybe let's zoom out in general, and I just have a couple associated questions to run by you. One, I remember in our first brief chat, I asked, is Babylon an L2? And you said, I don't particularly like that term. Yeah, I would agree. Like, it's just like everyone's calling everything an L2 now, and I almost don't think anything's an L2. What is your thought on just the language you use to talk about these systems which abstract or reference from Bitcoin? Is there such a thing as an L2? Is that just a improper mental model for talking about this? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so okay, so we can go back to this the place where this language L2 start, which is Ethereum. So Ethereum first you have the Ethereum main chain, and then you have these roll-ups that build on Ethereum, like Arbitrum, OP Stack, etc. Now they're called L2 because number one, they're borrowing the security from Ethereum. Number two, they are also borrowing the asset from Ethereum, the ETH asset. So there is a bridging aspect which bridges the asset from Ethereum to the L2 and back again. So I think those two are kind of the key defining features of an L2. One is security, and two is liquidity. The liquidity comes from the mother chain. So I think in my mind, L2 is actually a pretty well-defined concept. So I'm not objecting to the concept itself. I think my objection was to characterize Babylon as an L2 only. Okay, so Babylon is not really an L2 because Babylon is really a mechanism by which security from Bitcoin can be shared with L2s. You can think of it that way.
Yes, that's really helpful. That helps me wrap my head around it. It also helps me reconcile where I categorize these other proposals and initiatives and projects. Another kind of question, because you do cover a research background, you are a professor, and you've written various white papers, and I feel now it's 15 years out from the publication of the Bitcoin white paper.
Yes.
And I feel that we sometimes just kind of hand wave and take a lot of the things in it for granted. Maybe it's the only white paper many people have ever read.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts as a professor who has written white papers and who thinks through these things?
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on the Bitcoin white paper, just as a white paper in general? I'm curious where your thoughts are.
Yeah, actually, I should say I'm a researcher for many years, even before I entered the blockchain space. In fact, I never know this concept of white paper until I get into the Bitcoin space, when you start reading Nakamoto's paper. Because the papers I'm used to are research papers. Research papers have a lot of details. From a research paper, you can actually build systems. There should be enough details for intelligent expert to build a new system out of. Now, Nakamoto's white paper, which set the example of a white paper in blockchain, is not really a research paper at that level of rigor. It is really an idea paper. It's like, hey, I have these ideas. Now, of course, it also has a prototype, which is the Bitcoin protocol. But the thing about that white paper is that all these ideas turn out to be correct. There's no flaw that people could find in it. However, the level of details is lacking, but there are no flaws. So that's the remarkable thing about that paper.
That is, yeah, I really appreciate your perspective, especially because I'm not super familiar with the landscape of white papers, but you said we've seen no flaws in it. Is it common to find flaws in white papers?
No, yeah, it's actually very common. And I'll give you a good example, okay? So when the Ethereum proof of stake merge happens, there was a white paper that Vitalik and his team presented on the Ethereum proof of stake protocol. That was about a year and a half before the merge. We as in my group at Stanford, we studied that paper, and actually we find several attack vectors, several flaws in that protocol. So it's actually quite common.
So that's really interesting because sometimes these flaws we don't discover for years. Sometimes they're never discovered until they are exploited. And the Bitcoin protocol is now closer to 2 decades old and highly proliferated, a backbone of a lot of the American industrial infrastructure. And it's very important that things don't break now.
A very natural question is, hey, well, Nakamoto wrote this white paper, but how do we know this protocol is actually secure? Can someone steal money from this protocol, right? And it took researchers, now these are expert researchers, about 7 years from the point the white paper was written in 2001, 2008 to 2015, before the first security analysis, rigorous security analysis of Bitcoin appeared and showed us indeed Nakamoto's protocol is secure.
That's really interesting because I had not heard that. I do know that I occasionally see research from that mid-2010s era.
Mm-hmm.
Are you referring to like a series of research that was done during that time? I'm actually kind of curious to dig into this.
Yeah, it was written by a cryptographer. And is called the Bitcoin Backbone Protocol. So it abstracted away the details of the Bitcoin protocol, wrote a paper about it, and do a formal security analysis about it. And they published it in 2015-16 timeframe. That was even before I entered the blockchain space. So it's not my contribution, but it is what happened. It is done by essentially a very good cryptographer who really want to understand why and how Bitcoin protocol works.
So, yeah, I really appreciate you walking me through where you come from, the high level Babylon protocol, and then reflections on Bitcoin. What have I not asked you about Babylon? What do you think is important for like a listener of above average technical familiarity? What's important for them to know about Babylon?
Babylon protocol is much more than a blockchain, a new chain. It's not a new, in my mind, it's not really a new layer one. It's not like Sway or Ep30 of the world. It is really a protocol that connects the Bitcoin world with the proof of stake world, providing benefit to both. I think if we are successful, not to be immodest, if we're successful, we should be able to make a pretty significant impact on the whole crypto space. Because after all, the crypto space is, what is it, right? It's Bitcoin and a bunch of proof of stake chains.
Yeah. This would dramatically change things. I'm most struck by your comments on that it would change Bitcoin holders, because I had not considered that. Well, David, I really appreciate you coming by here and giving me your time. And I really enjoyed this conversation. What are your thoughts on Nashville? What are your thoughts on the Bitcoin conference in general? It feels a little bit different this year. It's gotten a little more political.
That's right.
How do you feel about that?
It's election year after all.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just arrived here myself for a few hours, and so I'm still absorbing the vibes here.
Yeah.
But it's great to be here. And Charlie, thanks a lot for having me on your show. It's really amazing talking to you.